Nick, it feels like sometimes the pandemic has really put us in uncharted territory when it comes to, major government spending to help with unemployment rates and keep businesses afloat, surging house prices, and now we've got record inflation. How do Canadians feel about our economic future?
Dour, sour, anxiety. When we look at the trend line, and every week with Bloomberg News, we track the consumer confidence. And check out the trend line. When you see the trend line, you can see about a year ago, the score out of 100 was like almost as high as 70 points, which is actually quite strong. And now we're cycling towards 50. And to put this into context, Michael, this is a 100-point scale. 50 is neutral. Once we get below 50, it's like being underwater in a swimming pool and negative. And there's been a negative trajectory over the last number of weeks on consumer confidence. This does not bode well for the economy. There's lots of speculation from economists that we could be going into not just a recession in Canada, perhaps even a global recession, as everyone deals with the shocks of, and why don't we just start the laundry list of negative news? Recovering from the pandemic, interest rates going up, the cost of goods going up, and uncertainty related to the war in Ukraine. Roll all those things up, and we're talking about a negative cocktail of pessimism when it comes to the economy and where Canadians are right now. A lot of anxiety too.
Well, on that cheery note, I just want to welcome everyone to a new episode of Trendline. I'm Michael Stittle.
And I'm Nick Nanos.
And of course, today we're talking about economic anxiety. You can see, Nick, it's already been bleeding into our politics here. Last night we had the Conservative leadership debate, the French language debate, and it was a huge topic there. We had Pierre Poilievre going after Jean Charest on his tax record, which he said led to inflation, and Patrick Brown going after Pierre Poilievre over his embrace of cryptocurrency. What did you make of all that last night?
Well, the debate, the French Conservative leaders debate was a take no prisoners knife fight in a telephone booth. Wow. Like you had Pierre Poilievre actually refer to his opponents, Patrick Brown and Jean Charest specifically, as corrupt. Like, come on. Like, where's the second ballot growth? Obviously, you think of it this way. You would think that candidates would be jockeying to have some sort of appeal because it's a ranked ballot, right? So when Poilievre sends a broadside into the Charest and the Patrick Brown campaigns, that basically says, hey, I don't want your second ballot support, because the reality is he's looking at kind of doing a full-on negative attack. But it happened both ways. He was on the receiving end on the cryptocurrency front from the candidates. But this does not look like a family or party that is united. And it looks like, the thing is regardless of who wins, there will be people that are not only disappointed, but will not feel as if they have a place within the Conservative Party of Canada. So, but think of, we talked about this in our other podcasts. Pierre Poilievre, anti-establishment, tapping into that pessimism, tapping into the concern and economic anxiety that people have, and basically saying that things have to change, and that, from his perspective at least, can't rely on what I'll say solutions from the past, have to think of new things. But messy. And it's going to be interesting to see how, coming out of this leadership, the Conservative Party will unite behind whoever the winner is in order to try to challenge the Liberals.
Yeah, you've said, Nick, in previous episodes that Poilievre and Charest are essentially going two completely different groups. Like, they're not going after the same membership votes. So the party really seems more and more divided, and they're playing this kind of zero-sum game. But as we've seen, it's in previous leadership races, it is a ranked ballot, and it's usually, everyone's kind of second choice or third choice that might come out on top. So what does that say for the other leadership hopefuls? Do you think we'll see any surprises?
Well, I think the ones to watch, two that I'm watching at least. Now, first of all, we know that Pierre Poilievre has a movement that he is harnessing for his leadership bid. So obviously he will do well and respectably in this. There's an expectation that Jean Charest will do well too, although we don't know how good his organization is going to be on the ground. Patrick Brown is going to be one to watch. He hasn't, he's been keeping fairly low key. He didn't even go to the first unofficial debate. But he's been keeping fairly low key, but the guy's an organizational machine. He should not be dismissed. He won the Ontario Progressive Conservative leadership and wasn't the odds-on favorite in that, was the underdog and won. So can't dismiss that person. Leslyn Lewis, she's a force to be reckoned with in the within the Conservative Party and the Conservative movement in Canada. Maybe she might be a second choice for some of the other candidates. So it's kind of like the playing billiards. You got the billiard table, and one of the balls gets struck, and then it's like stuff's going all over the place.
Yeah.
So unless someone can win on the first ballot, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the order is. Could we see some surprises where a candidate? I don't think there'll be a surprise if Leslyn Lewis comes in fourth. But it could be a surprise if Jean Charest, either wins on the first ballot or comes third on the first ballot. I think the expectation right now, the non-scientific expectation, is that Pierre Poilievre will be either first or second but who knows? It's really too early to tell. And there'll be a lot of memberships that come in, so there's not really any proper scientific research to know how all of the candidates are doing. So a lot of it is spinmeistering from the campaigns and people reading entrails of eyeballs on social media and YouTube videos.
Nick, I want to switch over to the Ontario election campaign, where we do have hard numbers. We've got your latest ballot tracking there. How are the parties doing? Well,
in the latest CP24 Nanos tracking that was released earlier this week, we have the Progressive Conservatives at 37%, 9 points back are the Liberals at 28, the NDP are at 23. If there were an election held today, and it's not held today or this week, it would probably be a Conservative majority government. The big question is, it looks like the NDP are going to lose seats, because you have to remember, Michael, in the last election, they had like 34%. Now they're down to 23. So they're going to lose some seats. The big question is, how many seats did they lose? And I think for the Conservatives, there's also a high probability that the Conservatives, even winning a majority government, will lose some seats. And it looks like the Liberals will be the beneficiaries. But who comes in second? A little too early to tell. Right now, the provincial Liberals have the advantage in terms of seat projections over the New Democrats, but there's a lot of really tight races between the NDP and the Liberals, and that could change quite quickly. But looks like Doug Ford's in cruise control. Why don't we just say he's not only in the driver's seat, he's on cruise control, just trying to get through the close of this election without making any mistake, because realistically, he's the only person that can derail his own campaign.
I'm curious about what issues are Ontario voters really hoping to be addressed right now, and what's the top concern?
Two big clusters, actually. Healthcare, as an unprompted issue of concern, comes in at around 25% in the weekly tracking that we're doing with CTV and CP24. But cost of living has been up about 7 points compared to the beginning of the campaign, at around 19% or thereabouts. And even things like fuel or the cost of gas was nowhere, absolutely nowhere 3-4 weeks ago. And now it's actually on the radar at around, I think, 1 out of every 20 Ontarians. So think of two buckets, Michael, kind of healthcare. And the healthcare bucket includes stuff like long-term care, funding for our hospitals, funding for frontline healthcare workers. Are we ready to kind of, get out of the pandemic and be resilient for future threats? Through to dollars and cents issues, price of gas, price of housing, rising interest rates, and stuff like that. Those being kind of the two real dominant buckets of issues. And environment still does well at around 10%, but I think of healthcare and kind of economic issues as the two key things that Ontario voters want to hear about.
So it brings us back to this, I guess the theme of this episode of economic anxiety, Nick. And if voters feel this way, I mean, does that help or hinder the incumbent party? I mean, is this good for Ford or bad for Ford?
Well, usually you'd think that if people are grumpy, that it's bad for the incumbent government. We asked a question, we asked all Ontarians whether they're pessimistic or optimistic about the future for the province. And Ontarians tended to be more pessimistic than optimistic. Like I think about 45% were kind of in the negative group and about 37% in the positive group, and the rest were neutral. But the kicker, and this was really quite striking, is that if you happen to be an Ontarian that's under 35 years of age, you were much more pessimistic. And the only group that's optimistic about the future, people that are 55 years of age, they were net positive. So when you think of that anger, the pessimism, the anxiety, it's more targeted and focused on middle-aged and younger Ontarians compared to Ontarians that are over 55 years of age.
I mean, we won't know until all the ballots are in this election, but I'm very curious what the voter turnout will be this time around. If that pessimism in the younger age groups will drive them to vote or maybe keep them home. It should be interesting.
Yeah, well, think of it this way. With healthcare as the top unprompted provincial issue of concern, you think that might not be good for Ford, right? Because in the same polling that we've done, it suggests that Ford is the most trusted on economic issues, and Horwath is the most trusted on health issues. But you know what? None of those things have stuck. And to your question, is it good news or bad news? It looks like, right now, for many Ontarians, they're probably looking at all the candidates, all the leaders in terms of risk. And you know what? Let's face it, Ford's not running against perfection, because if he was, he'd probably be in big trouble. He's running against like other party leaders like Del Duca and Horwath. So that's all he has to do, is to be like this much taller, and then he wins. Maybe he's not tall at all politically. He just needs to like this much taller, and he wins the election, which speaks to my comment about the only person, in my opinion, that at this point in the campaign that can derail the trend line is Doug Ford himself.
Oh, Nick, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about support for NATO in Europe. So Nick, last week you were in Germany, and I'm curious what the view is there now on their energy policy moving away from Russia, but also NATO overall. How do they feel about two Nordic countries potentially joining?
Wow, like when I was in Germany, everybody is fixated on Ukraine and what's going on there, and that's close for the Germans. Ukraine is not that far away, and no one ever thought that NATO and Germany specifically and other kind of European countries would be in, I'll call it a hot war against the Russians, where a number of European countries, Canada and the United States, are not only doing economic sanctions, but are actually arming and supporting the Ukrainians in their fight against the invasion from Russia. But we did a really cool survey. So we did a survey of 1,000 Germans and 1,000 Canadians. And I'd like to say that we did the survey in cooperation with our partner organization or sister organization, DMAP, which is one of the top pollsters in Germany. And we asked the Germans about their favorability of NATO. And we also asked Canadians about their favorability of NATO. And about 7 out of every 10 Germans had a favorable or somewhat favorable view of NATO. That jumps up to 8 out of every 10 among Canadians. So the NATO brand is actually quite strong in Germany and Canada. And the other thing is that when we look at both of the countries and their perceptions of each other, just in general, and being on issues like who do you want to work with or who would you kind of get along, Canada actually scores exceptionally well. At the top of the German list is France and Canada in terms of
Wow.
countries to work together with. And then at the top of the Canadian list is the United Kingdom, not a big surprise because of our traditional connection to the United Kingdom, and Germany. And I forgot to mention, I have to say, full disclosure, I am the volunteer chair of the Atlantic Brücke Canada, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is focused on building stronger dialogue and ties with Canada and Germany. So, but you know what? The numbers are the numbers. So NATO still very strong in both countries. And there's some potential there in terms of how favorably Germans look at Canadians and how favorably Canadians look at Germans.
Now, in terms of their energy policy, I mean, for years and years, the idea in Germany, of course, was closer ties with Russia would actually be beneficial to both countries and you know, ease the risk of war. Obviously, that didn't turn out. So how do they feel now about? I mean, which energy partners do they want their reserves from now?
And you know, the Germans are literally fixated on whether the Russians will turn off the taps, literally, of the you know, the pipeline and the energy, because you know, Russia is one of the major suppliers of energy, not just to Europe, but especially of Germany. And Germany right now is effectively looking to find alternatives. So in the same study that we did with DMAP in Germany, you know, we asked Germans and Canadians who they'd like to see as energy partners. And in the survey that was conducted by DMAP of Germans, Canada actually tops the list on the energy partner front at around 64%. And then, you know, a second is kind of Australia. But when you look at the German list of who they'd like to have as energy partners, their real energy partner is like, man, at the bottom of the list. When you look at that number for Russia, like, you know, it's quite negative. So, you know, thinking of all the different choices that Germans have when it comes to energy partners, Canada, Australia, the Middle East, Russia, stuff like that. Canada is clearly at the top of the list. And you know, when we ask the same question among Canadians in the survey that was done by Nanos, it's actually a three-way tie between Australia, Germany, and the US. So the fact that the US is part of the mix, not a big surprise because we're already significant energy partners. But Germany is seen as being just as appealing as the United States or Australia. And it speaks to the opportunity for kind of more dialogue and relations between Canada and Germany.
Nick, thanks. That's a great episode. And as always, thanks very much for your insights.
It was fun.